Thanks for coming, everyone. It's great to have you guys again. Still some food over there, so feel free to take some seconds while this talk is going on. Still some drinks available up there at the bar. Tonight we're going to have Carrie Weaver talk to us on Christian architecture and a little bit on art too. She's a member at St. John Gualbert Cathedral in Johnstown. She got her PhD from the University of Virginia. She's a Mediterranean archaeologist. She's a research affiliate with the University of Pittsburgh and is also a Smithsonian Journeys expert. So she has a lot of expertise from over her career. So without further ado, let's welcome her up and have her talk to us about architecture.
Thank you so much for that warm welcome. So as I'm getting situated here, I just want to give a little bit of detail about what we'll be talking about today. So the topic was endless possibilities for Christian art and architecture. And as I was thinking about what I wanted to discuss with you tonight, I thought it might be very interesting to talk a little bit more about the places we worship in weekly and sometimes daily. So I'm going to begin at the very beginning and talk a little bit about how the church form was developed and why we worship in churches and not temples. And then about halfway through, we'll switch gears and talk about different church architecture styles and also use examples of those styles from around town. So a lot of them should be pretty familiar. But let's start at the beginning. So in order to understand how we got church architecture and how it took its final form, we need to understand Roman religion. So during the Roman Empire, the Romans were polytheistic. They worshipped many gods, and the majority of their worship took place in temples. Well, outside of temples. So here's an example of a Roman temple on the screen. And you can see, I'll walk you through it just very briefly. So it's very frontally focused. There's a door at the end, there's a series of stairs, and then there's columns across the front. And these columns are illusionistic along the side. They look like they're columns, but they're actually carved in relief. So you only can stand on this front porch area. But there was no need to be able to go into the temple because Romans did everything on the outside. They practiced animal sacrifice, that took place outside. They would pray, they would burn incense, they would sing songs, and they would offer different types of offerings to the gods, all outside the temple. The reason for this is because the inside of the temple was the sacred space. That was the space that was dedicated to the god, and they believed that the god lived inside of that inner space, super holy. And it was the place where you could see a statue, an image of the god, and only priests and temple attendants were allowed to be inside. So the people who were worshiping were allowed to look inside the temple whenever the doors were open, and they could see the cult statue, which was the statue of the god, and feel like they were having an encounter with the god in that mind space. But again, not allowed to go inside. So the Romans worshipped, as I said, many gods, and they also worshipped their emperor. The emperor was a god himself. And this worship of many gods worked very well for the Romans, because as they conquered different areas, they could assimilate gods from those areas into their pantheon, into their group of gods. So they were able to very quickly assimilate people in those conquered regions to the Roman religion. And that Roman religion was a civic religion. Everyone was expected to practice it, and especially everyone was expected to treat the emperor as a god himself. Now within this larger, broader Roman religion, we had things called mystery cults. And you can consider those to be add-ons. So what the mystery cults had in common were they were almost like secret societies of today, where you had to be initiated into the secret society, and when you were initiated, you learned the secrets, and that's why we call it a mystery cult. And these typically focused on personal salvation and personal improvement, usually in the afterlife. So it was something that you could be, it was like an addendum or an add-on to the civic religion. You would practice regular Roman religion, but you could also have the option to take part in the mystery cult. The mystery cult concept is where Christianity fit in the very beginning. And it was seen as a mystery cult because people were focused on their personal salvation, and that was in alignment with all the other Roman mystery cults. So that made sense to the Romans. Where Roman religion and Christianity went awry was that Christianity was monotheistic. All the other mystery cults were not. They allowed for the worship of many gods. So when Christians refused to worship the emperor and the other gods, that's where the problem took place. So to give you an idea, I described at the beginning how the temple would have looked and how it would have functioned. And this is what's called a cutaway reconstruction. So here, the walls and the columns have been cut away so you can see inside. This is that cult statue that I was telling you about, the image of the god. In this case, it's meant to be Zeus. Or Jupiter, his Roman name. So here's a representation of Jupiter, and you can see priest attendants inside the sacred space, and people outside, who again would have looked in and seen this representation of the god. One thing to keep in mind when you think about architecture is that architecture shapes our experience. Where doors are located tells us where to enter. Where features are in the room tells us where to look and where to focus our attention. In a Roman temple, it's very linear and on a central axis. So you look in the door and you immediately see the main attraction, the cult statue. It really focuses one's experience. So a wrench is thrown in the works in 33 whenever Christ dies. And his stories and his teachings are passed on through his apostles. And you can see on this map that there are some areas that are indicated in darker blue. And these are the earliest areas that were Christianized. And the map is showing the areas that were Christianized around 300. And then over time it spreads. And it spreads very quickly in the period between 300 and 600. And that's that teal color. The reason for that is because Christianity is legalized by the Roman Empire at the end of the 4th century. And then the later areas to be Christianized are shown in yellow here. So during that early period, whenever Christianity was not legalized, and when there was a problem because early Christians were refusing to worship the gods of the state, they were refusing to be polytheistic. So for that reason, they were persecuted. They were seen as antisocial, not willing to participate in state religion. So for that reason, they had to worship in secret. And the earliest churches were houses. So they would take a house and they would retrofit it so that it would serve as a place of worship and a place of meeting. And one of the best examples of this comes from Syria. So here, if you can see my little laser pointer, is where Syria is located, and we're focusing on the site of Dura-Europos. This is a map of Dura-Europos, and right here is where the house church is located. And this is a reconstruction of how it was configured. So from the outside, it looked like a church. It didn't look like anything that would flag attention or flag suspicion. One would walk into the vestibule and notice that there's a wall here, so you can't see what's going on in the rest of the room. And again, remember, architecture shaping our experience. If someone were to wander in the door, it would immediately block their view. So one makes a little jog and enters into a courtyard. This could be an area for meeting in terms of like social space, social interactions. Like when many of us came in, you stood around the bar. You could consider the courtyard as a type of bar-like space where people would meet and they would talk and they would informally interact. There was a teaching space for various educational pursuits, and there was an assembly room. And we imagine this is where the early masses would have taken place. There's also a baptistry, and there are stairs to a second level. We don't know what was on the second level. But what we can see from this configuration is that it focuses on the two sacraments that were most important to the early church, namely the Eucharist, which would have taken place in the assembly room, and the baptistry, so baptism. Eucharist and baptism were the two most important. The baptistry is interesting because, and this is where the art comes in, we have some remains of frescoes that were used to adorn the walls in the baptistry. And they probably look like fragments to you, and they don't look very clear or interesting, but I'm going to walk you through it. So this is the actual baptistry. There's an immersion pool here where someone can get in up to their waist. And we're going to look at the frescoes that are located here and also off to the side. And the one that you can probably see in greatest detail is this one across the bottom. There are two women, and what you have to take my word for this, in a large grand Roman tomb. Because Roman tombs were the only concept that these Christians had of a tomb, they used it to represent the tomb of Christ. Even though it doesn't fit the biblical description, this is still what they used to represent the tomb. And here are the two women who are, it was the women who were at the tomb and who found that Christ was gone. Now above, we see two scenes from biblical stories that are fixed on the theme of salvation. So at the top, this is Christ, this is Jesus, and there's a man who's lying on a cot. So this rectangular area here is the cot, and this is the man, and he's gesturing. What he's doing is healing a paralyzed man. So this over here, you can almost think of it as a comic strip that's in reverse. So this is meant to be the next scene, where the man picks up his cot and walks away, healed. Over here, in this fresco that's broken, we see a ship, and also waves on the water, and two people walking on the water. And that's the representation of the walking on the water story, where Christ saves Peter, because if you recall that story, he begins to doubt. So when he doubts, he starts to sink. And this is, again, following that theme of salvation. So he heals the paralytic, and he saves Peter. So those are in the baptistry, and we can make the interpretive leap that baptism leads to salvation. It paves the way to salvation. So even the earliest Christians were thinking along those lines. Now in the arced area, right above the baptistry, there is an image of a man with a sheep on his shoulders, and also a flock of sheep. And that's the Good Shepherd motif, which was very common in ancient art, in ancient Christian art. So here we see two representations of men who are meant to be Jesus, who have sheep across their shoulders, and that's the very standard and iconic Good Shepherd motif. And also here at the bottom, there's a later edition that was scrawled almost like graffiti, and it's representing Adam and Eve. And they're caught in a moment. They're caught in a moment right when they realize that they're naked. So they're covering themselves with their hands, and you can see them amid the trees in the Garden of Eden. Now you might be wondering, where do catacombs fit into this? Because probably part of the historical narrative you've heard is that Christians worship in secret in catacombs. We're not so sure that's true. There's not much archaeological evidence for that. So catacombs were in many major cities of the ancient world. They were located underground. The ones in Rome were dug and created by Christians, and they were outside of the city walls. This is important because there was, in ancient belief, there was a distinction that everything that was living needed to be inside of the city walls, and everything that was dead needed to be outside the city walls, because the dead could be polluting. So even though they were underground, these catacombs were positioned outside the walls of Rome. They were used primarily as cemeteries. And if you look at the wall, you can see a lot of spaces here. And also there were larger spaces where people could gather for funerary rituals. And the reason for this is because at the time, they were first created in the 2nd century. At the time this was happening, Romans primarily cremated their dead, and early Christians believed that that wasn't acceptable. So they needed a place to bury their dead in secret, and also perform their secret funerary rituals. So, secret funerals. These spaces were primarily used for that reason, and likely they were not used for worship until the public acceptance of Christianity at the end of the 4th century. At the end of the 4th century, we do start to see altars being created in catacombs, and also there's a basilica that's semi-underground. It's partially above ground and partially in the catacomb. And the reason for this change is connected to this guy here. So this is a colossal statue of Emperor Constantine. And you can see this is the size of an average person, and this is the size of the statue. Notice that he's looking upward and that he has one finger up. This has been interpreted as looking towards the heavens and indicating that there's one God. So it's a very symbolic sculpture. And he becomes the first emperor to pave the way for the acceptance and legalization of Christianity because he converts himself. Now before this, remember, Romans are persecuting Christians because they're seen as antisocial, they don't follow the state religion, and their ideas of monotheism are dangerous because they subvert the power of the emperor who should have been seen as a god. So at the moment when an emperor converts, it's really powerful. And his conversion story is one that happens in an instant if we're to believe the historical record. He found himself in the middle of a civil war. At the time Constantine came to power, there were 2 emperors, one who ruled the east and one who ruled the west. This had happened the reign before his, and it worked out just fine. But when Constantine and his co-emperor became successors, that was when it all fell apart, because each of them wanted to consolidate power and have it all to themselves. So they fight the civil war, and the decisive victory took place at a place called the Milvian Bridge. And this happened in 312. And at the Milvian Bridge, Constantine believed he saw a sign. And the sign that he saw above the battlefield was what we know as the Chi-Rho. So that's what you're seeing here in the corner of the screen. It's called the Chi-Rho because it's the first 2 letters of Christ's name in Greek. So this X-like figure is the Greek letter chi, and this thing that looks like a P is the Greek letter that stands for R, basically, is rho. And so Christos would be, this is chi is CH, if we're thinking of transliteration, and then P is R rho is R. So first few letters of Christ's name. So he sees the symbol above the battlefield, and he realizes that it's going to be the Christian God that allows him to win the day. So he does credit his victory to God. In 313, so 1 year later, 1 year after he's become sole Roman emperor, he grants religious tolerance to all groups. So it was not just the Christians who were experiencing some, persecution. There were other religious groups as well. So the Edict of Milan grants religious tolerance and doesn't require people to follow the official state religion. In 315, he builds a huge arch, the Arch of Constantine. It's in Rome, and you might have heard of it. And in the inscription on that, he credits the Christian God with his civil war victory at the Milvian Bridge. And then at the end of the 4th century, Christianity becomes the official religion of the empire. And at that point, they have a problem. So we know what a Roman church, or a Roman temple is supposed to look like, but what are these new churches supposed to look like? They can't look like temples, because there was a desire to make an intentional break between the old architecture and the old religion and the new. So they needed to have a new form of architecture for this new religion. Also, Roman temples just didn't fit. They weren't functional for Christian purposes, and they didn't symbolically work with Christian purposes. Christians, for example, were used to worshiping on the inside of buildings because they worshipped in secret for so long. So all of their practices took place inside of the building. So they needed an architectural place where they could worship inside and not outside, like Roman temples. Also, this created symbolically a clear separation from the people who were faithful on the inside from the people who were unfaithful, who would have been primarily on the outside. And then it was important symbolically to be situated near the tombs of Christian martyrs because they hadn't forgotten their past and they hadn't forgotten what got them to the place they were today. So that was intentional as well. And to get them by tombs, they needed to be outside of the city walls because that's where the tombs were. And also, buildings needed to convey a new sense of authority. So Christianity was no longer marginalized, it was taking center stage. So they decided to adopt a building that gave them all of those things. So it worked symbolically, functionally, gave them authority, and also made a break from the old religion. And that was the basilica form. So finally, I'm sure you're like, yes, I know this word. Heard of basilica. The basilica is actually the form, the architectural form that was used for Roman law courts. So that's where the authority comes from. Because the magistrate who would have been present in the basilica, who would have sat enthroned, basically, at the front of the basilica to make legal decisions, had the authority of the emperor. So there was a strong association with this building, with authority, and also it was secular. So it wasn't a sacred space. It had no association with ancient Roman religion. It made that intentional break. Now, as we look at this plan, let me walk you through it. So this area here is basically like the narthex. These circles are columns, but you should recognize some of the words here used to describe the architecture as words that describe church architecture today. So we've got aisles, we've got a nave, and this tribunal area would be where the altar is located. So I talked about architecture shaping our experience, and if you look here, when you would walk in to a basilica, all of your attention would be focused on the front, where the magistrate would be located, and then in a Christian church, where the altar would be placed. Over time, and Constantine actually commissioned this before he converted and adopted Christianity. The basilica was also used by emperors as audience halls. So the emperor would sit in the middle of this semicircular area, which is called an apse. And this is where he would receive foreign dignitaries and other people who were seeking his attention. If you look at the plan, you can see here, it's a rectangular form, and we've got that semicircular area where the emperor would sit enthroned at an audience hall. So again, the basilica still is imbued with this sense of authority. So Constantine, as a Roman emperor, would have, before he converted, he would have commissioned temples, and that was part of his pious duty to the Roman people. When he converted, he recognized the need to commission churches. And one of the first churches that was commissioned was the Basilica of St. Peter's. So this is Old St. Peter's, located on the same spot as New St. Peter's, which might be more familiar to you. But Old St. Peter's was created in the basilica style. And here we see a cutaway reconstruction of it, and this is the plan. So for me, it's a little, I'll walk you through this one. It's a little easier for me with the plan, but I can recognize they're confusing. So you walk in through the front gate, up the stairs through the front gate, and there's a courtyard where you can gather, reminiscent of the church house that we looked at in the beginning. So again, a gathering space for informal social interaction. And then you walk into the basilica itself, and it has that same form as the law courts and the Roman audience halls. So there's a nave, there are aisles, and there's an apse. There's also an area that's been added, and it's called the transept. And that gives it a cross-like or cruciform shape. So that is heavily symbolic as well. And the transept in Old St. Peter's is where relics of St. Peter were located. And the basilica itself was built over the grave of St. Peter. Social memory had reminded people or stayed alive where St. Peter was buried, and the basilica was built on top of that. We have ancient paintings of the Basilica of St. Peter's, and this is actually an ancient cutaway reconstruction made at a time before modern architectural drawings, when I don't know if they ever even thought about cutaways, but here we go. So we get a sense of what it looked like in the inside. So the altar would have been located here in the apse, We see the nave and the aisles off to each side. We get a sense for how the floor was paved and what it looked like inside the church. There is one basilica from this time period that still stands. The rest have been torn down, and it's in Rome, and it's called Santa Sabina. So this gives us a sense of what these early basilicas would have looked like. Again, a nave area, side aisles, and the altar, which is located in the apse. And it's very nondescript from the outside. It's not very decorative. Ancient temples were very, very ornate, ancient pagan temples. So the Christians made an intentional break from the old religion in that way as well. They decided that they didn't want to have very ornate temples. Now there are some exceptions. And these are examples where temples were retrofitted into churches. I don't have a picture of it because it's all been stripped away, but one of the most famous is the Parthenon in Athens. Parthenon means Parthenos, and it's dedicated to Athena Parthenos, the Virgin Athena. So it was really just a half step to go from the Virgin Athena to the Virgin Mary, and it becomes a church dedicated to the Virgin Mary. And that is an example, and the reason why they chose to retrofit some temples was because they wanted to encourage people to worship in places where they always had. So that was one of the reasons why they would retrofit the temples. There are two really good examples from Sicily. I'm going to show you one. So if you look at the outside, it looks like a church, normal church. Later we'll learn that it's Baroque. But when you start to look at the architectural details, you can see it was once a temple. So the freestanding columns that are very typical of a temple are still present, but they fill them in with blocks so they can create an enclosed interior space. The walls of that holy room where the cult statue was located were thick block with no windows. The early architects cut arches into them to create a nave space and side aisles, so it was more conducive to Christian worship. And in the background you can see the columns that have been included in the wall. And there's other aspects as well. So this is a giant ancient Greek punch bowl, essentially. It's called a crater. It was used for mixing water with wine. The Greeks never drank undiluted wine. They thought it wasn't a good idea, and really maybe it's not. But at any rate, they would mix water with wine, and then they would scoop it out with a ladle and put it into different cups. So they took this ancient Greek punch bowl and turned it into a baptismal font. So that was still retained. But one other addition was that they added on this area here that's lit. Because if you remember, the inside of Roman temples were so dark. No windows, no light, only when the door was open. So they created an apse, and they created lighting from the top to allow the light to come inside. Okay, so that's how we got to the initial church architectural form. But now let's take a look at some of the different types of architectural styles. And we'll use examples from Johnstown to make it, well, from the greater Johnstown area, I believe, to bring it home. So the first unique style that we see after the fall of the Roman Empire is the Byzantine style. The Byzantine Empire is founded in the east, in Byzantium, which is now Istanbul, and it spreads across parts of Europe, select parts of Europe. And in Italy, we have some great examples of standing Byzantine churches. So they have a circular shape, they have a dome, and one reason for the circular shape is because Roman mausoleums were circular, and it gave them an opportunity to put the bodies of martyrs inside of the church as a focal point. So they enjoyed that symbolism, and it was powerful to them. Sometimes they're in the shape of a Greek cross, and a Greek cross could be circular. It's where the long portion is just as long as the horizontal one. They also reject classical artistic styles. So what I mean by that is Figures that are proportionate. So in Byzantine style, they look like they're floating. They don't really look like accurate human beings or those perfect depictions of human beings and animals. They also have an interesting color palette. They choose a lot of golds, and the reason for that is because when the sun came in and sparkled off the gold, it made people feel as if they were in heaven. So it had this ethereal, heavenly aspect about it. There is an emphasis on light, and again, the symbolic connection to heaven, and it was made you feel like you were in or embraced by the dome of heaven. So this is an example from we saw the outside of the church. This one is called San Vitale. This is what it looked like on the inside. So here you can see the emphasis on light. It's very bright in the space. Lots of gold mosaics. If we were to look closely at these people, they look very two-dimensional. They don't have three-dimensionality about them. And if we're to think of the closest example, which I would call Byzantine revival, it's probably St. Mary's Byzantine Catholic Church. So it's got the dome, if we're to tick off the stylistic traits. It's got the rejection of classical artistic styles. So again, two-dimensional figures that kind of look like people. They don't 100% look like people. And not three-dimensional perfect figures. Also, there's a lot of gold backgrounds that we see throughout the space. You can see it here in the apse area and also over here as well. And a huge emphasis on light. So in this church, the light comes streaming in from the dome and illuminates the space. The next iteration on style we get, the least major style, is the Romanesque style. Romanesque literally means Roman-like. So it uses a lot of Roman architectural features. Those are round arches, barrel vaults, which are what they sound like. If you took a barrel, cut it in half, put it on top of walls, that's a barrel vault. Sturdy pillars that hold up this vaulted ceiling. Large towers on the outside. Very symmetrical plan. And to hold up, again, this high ceiling, very thick walls that, because in some cases they're so high, they don't allow for a lot of light to filter in, so they're really dark interior spaces. Kind of fun to think. Can you guys think of any examples of Romanesque? Yeah.
Saint-Ouen in Histoire.
Perhaps the best one we have in Johnstown itself. So it's got those heavy walls. It's not quite as symmetrical on the outside because it only has one bell tower. I question whether that was a function of cost rather than anything else. But it has barrel vaults, so these with round ribs. It's got sturdy pillars holding up the wall, and it is, aside from the bell tower, very symmetrical in plan. Okay, the next iteration is Gothic style. This is a pejorative name, so whenever people during the Renaissance looked at Gothic churches, Gothic became a pejorative because they're like, oh, that's gross, that looks like something the Goths would create. So the Goths were people who were, at the time, deemed responsible for destroying Rome and overrunning the Roman Empire, so it was pejorative. But this one has a lot of emphasis on light, this particular style. So there are very high walls that are often described as skeletal. They're very high to allow for a lot of light to filter into the space. And they're able to be so high because they are supported by what's called flying buttresses. You can see those on the outside of the walls. The example here is Notre Dame in Paris. This is before it was rebuilt. But these supports here are called flying buttresses. So you can see that they're heavy supports and then they are attached to the walls. They also have a different kind of vaulting system. This one's called a rib vault. You can see these segments that are called ribs, and they hold the vault, and they give it a different shape and a different function than the barrel vaults that we just looked at. And one of their most iconic, I guess, characteristics of the Gothic style are pointed arches. And we can see that here with the arches in the nave. An example here is another decommissioned church, Immaculate Conception, which is now called the Grand Hall. So it's got an emphasis on light. It's got rib vaults, which you can see here, and also pointed arches. And the pointed arches are located across the windows and all throughout the interior space of the church. Even if you look at the outside, the entrance, which is called the portal, is also, it has these pointed arches, and it's very reminiscent of the entrances of Gothic churches. Next major style is the Renaissance style. So after the Gothic, we have a return to interest in classical proportions, so Greek and Roman architecture and Greek and Roman artistic styles. So we can call this classical architectural vocabulary. The buildings look like Roman and Greek buildings did. There are specific rules for the forms of the buildings and also the placement of decorative elements and the proportions. And this was a time of great architectural theorizing and also experimentation. And I would say, any guesses on this one? This is kind of hard. Any guesses on churches around town that might be Renaissance? I wrestled with this. Go ahead.
The cathedral downtown.
You were good. You were good, sir. This is the closest that I can find that is Renaissance inspired. I would also call it neoclassical. Now, one thing to keep in mind with modern churches is that they can be an amalgamation of styles, and that's typically what we see. They don't just fit one bucket, but rather they can tick a bunch of different boxes. They have lots of architectural influences. This one I do believe is the closest to Renaissance. It has a classical architectural vocabulary. So the classical or Greco-Roman architectural features are the round arches. These, if you're familiar with the cathedral, they look like pillars, but they're in relief. So they only jut out a little bit. They're not freestanding. That's called a pilaster or a pilaster. It's pronounced both ways. There's also a coffered ceiling, which is recesses, the square recesses you see at the top, where there's what's called a rosette in the center. That's a very classical architectural form, and the reason they did that is because it makes the ceiling a little bit lighter, at least in ancient Roman buildings. I'm not sure if it does the same as St. John's, but that's where it comes from. And there's, again, an emphasis on symmetry and also classical rules of proportion. The Baroque is super interesting because it's also a bit of a pejorative. It's based on a Portuguese word, barroco, which means an irregular or imperfect pearl. And it's an intentional distortion of the Renaissance. So instead of following rules, it breaks all the rules. And it's meant to be emotional and expressive and energetic. And it creates these types of feelings in the way that it's shaped. So there is a lot of curvilinear forms. Instead of straight rectangular lines, you see these wavy curves. A lot of grandeur. So they're very large and very impressive to look at, but also very theatrical. So usually the sculptures that you see are doing something. They're caught in a moment. They are perhaps pleading with someone. They're doing a lot of theatrical things. They add to the element of stage interest. Lots of optical illusions and dramatic projections. So this sculpture is here, but the niche that it sits in is deeply recessed. So it creates play on light and shade, and that adds to the element of drama. Inside, there are richly textured surfaces and usually a lot of gilding. So we see a lot of gold here too. And one interesting thing is that they take classical architectural forms and they deliberately break them, they make them incomplete, or they change them somehow. So in a temple, this portion would be triangular. Here, they slap a circle in the middle, just for a little bit of drama. Now, I wasn't able to find a church in town that was entirely Baroque, but I found an altar. And it's from Resurrection Parish, it's a back altar. And it has this distortion of architectural forms. So these are all curved, that curvilinear nature, but they're broken. They're not complete curves or complete triangles like you would see in Greek and Roman temples. There's contrasting light and color. So we've got the very colorful sculptures and paintings, and that contrast with the very white, stark nature of the marble. There is a sense of grandeur. It's very well lit. There's also a sense of drama because we see a scene unfolding in front of us here. It's telling us a story and inviting us in. And then after that, after the Baroque, we've got what's called the Rococo style, and it's super ornate. It's almost like decoration just vomited all over the church. Very ornate. We've got motifs like shells, curving, lots of curves. You can see the spiral columns. If you can imagine, and you've seen the interior of St. Peter's, there's what's called a baldacchino. What was that? Oh, sorry. Around the altar, and it's got spiral columns. That's a Baroque feature. There are a lot of Baroque features in the modern St. Peter's. They avoid symmetry, and they use a lot of pastel colors with gold accents. And I'm going to show you an example that's Rococo inspired around town. But for the most part, what we see after the Rococo period are revival styles. So neoclassical, which is a revival of Greco-Roman and Renaissance. We see Gothic revival, and then we see contemporary church styles. So I think Queen of Peace Parish is the closest to being, is that yours? Yep. Is that your parish? Okay. I think that Queen of Peace is the closest to being Rococo inspired, and that's because of the overly ornate style, the use of curving motifs, and also some classical elements, and the explosion of light pastel colors, as well as the gold accents. And we see a lot of that sumptuous detail and decoration, especially in the apse area around the altar. Now, just for fun, St. Benedict's would be what we consider contemporary style. There are a lot of contemporary style churches around the area. St. Anthony's of Padua in Wimber is one. St. Andrew's is another one. These were made after World War II to support a booming population. So they built them large. They have really large interiors, big open spaces. They used modern materials like glass and steel heavily. And the stained glass windows, instead of looking like actual scenes, they tend to be more abstract, and they tend to be more geometric as well. Okay, so that is our quick journey through time. Do you have any questions? Yes.
Our Mother of Sorrows, just off the top of your head, what styles would you?
That's a great question. So there are aspects of Our Mother of Sorrows that I would consider to be Old English, especially the ceiling. The outside looks very Tudor to me, so I would say that that's more rooted in the British Isles than it would be in some of the continental examples we looked at today. Yeah.
So in the House Church of Dura-Europos, there's a teaching space and an assembly room. How do the archaeologists determine the difference?
I think it was based on what they found inside of those rooms. Dura-Europos is really interesting. It's a super interesting site because what happened, the way that it was destroyed meant that a lot of material was kept in situ, kept in place. It had been attacked by Sasanians, who are another ethnic group that lived in Asia Minor at the time. And they had attacked the city by sapping it. So they dug underneath the city walls. And if you recall that city map, Dura-Europos was right on the city wall. They dug underneath it, the wall collapsed, and the rubble of the city wall covered the church. So they were able to find a lot of the, it was almost like a time capsule. They could find a lot of the material that was used in the different rooms in place.
Isn't it in Germany now? Like, didn't they move it?
Yeah, so they did move big parts of it. I want to say that some of the frescoes might be at Yale as well, unless they were only there temporarily. But they did move it to preserve it. Dura-Europos, on a separate tangent, has been completely destroyed since 2011. If you look at a satellite image of it, and for funsies you might want to pull it up, but it looks like the craters of the moon. So I showed you one where it was intact. Now it has been completely excavated illicitly, not by shovels, by large excavation equipment. And they've done that so that we imagine it's the people from the Syrian government itself. Because to get those huge excavators onto the site, it had to have some sort of permission granted. But they did that so that they could loot artifacts and sell them on the black market. Antiquities are pretty profitable. But great question, yeah.
This might be very local. Is there a main reason why they chose stone over brick in some areas? And was brick prominent around here because we were just really close to the brick plants?
It's a good question. I'm not entirely sure why they made that decision. I think it was probably made on a parish by parish level. So I think that if you had a congregation with a lot of really great stonemasons and access to stone, you're going to see big stone churches.
That was passed down for years. From
Yes.
that the parishioners worked at brick plants and they volunteered their time to build.
Yeah.
Oh,
Actually, I can answer part of that.
Oh,
because
please do.
it's connected to the history of St. John's. St. John's is actually a really interesting architectural church because it's a turning point in church architecture. It was the very first church to be framed with steel. Every church prior to that, everything we're seeing in the old churches, you had to figure out how you were going to get the structures to hold. St. John's was the first time they made a steel frame, and then everything else around it was decorative or filling in the holes, but it wasn't structural. So, because you could now build with steel, brick was so much cheaper because your frame was already made with steel, so you could use brick on all the stuff, whereas older places needed the stone for the structural security.
Yeah, so interesting. And it was made with steel because it was, and correct me if I'm wrong, but it was rebuilt with money from Pittsburgh steel money and steel from Pittsburgh connections because it was destroyed, well, the previous church was destroyed during the flood. Type of penance by those robber barons.
To kind of play off that previous question, so a lot of the churches you were showing an example of, I noticed there was about 3 of them you picked out of Cambria City, including 2 of the decommissioned ones. Do you think part of the reason why a lot of them, why the architecture, or the architects and stuff, selected that style is because of like the primary nationalities of those, of the congregations? Because like St. Columba was predominantly Irish, St. Mary's was very Slavonic, or Slav, and Immaculate Conception very Germanic.
Yes, I think you're onto something there. I do think that the ethnicity and the background of the parishioners had a lot to do with it. So all of these churches had architects, and many of them were from Pittsburgh. So there was a plan that went into the creation of the churches, and they definitely took the ethnicity into account because at that time they weren't necessarily neighborhood churches; they were ethnic churches. They were places where people of the same ethnicity could gather to worship, to in many cases speak their own language, keep alive their traditions, and just have some sense of fraternity by gathering together. And people poured a lot of money and time into the creation of the churches, because if you think about it, when these churches were being created, life was tough. There was a lot of factory work happening in town, and going to church, working at church, being with people who you had something in common with was a great respite and gave people a sense of peace. So they put a lot of time into it. So it was important to maintain those familiarities where possible. Great question.
So on the topic of art more so than architecture, so Eastern Catholic, Eastern Orthodox, Eastern Apostolic churches still have all this Eastern iconography and whatnot. And all of us Western Catholic people, we have all of our stained glass and all that. And I know, like, if you look back far, you see a lot of iconography and whatnot. And maybe you and Father Matt, you both probably know a lot about this. I know not much about it. But where did the split or the change of all that, like, when do we start getting all the stained glass and all this, and as opposed to iconography?
It goes, so the differences you're describing go back to the Roman Empire. And before Constantine, I had talked briefly about how the Civil War came to be and how there were 2 emperors. Let me give you a little more context and then I'll answer your question. So they decided that the Roman Empire was too big, and they thought that a good decision would be to cut it in half, where you've got the Eastern Empire and the Western Empire. The Eastern Empire was ruled by an emperor and an apprentice. And almost like the Sith, if you're interested in Star Wars. Got the master and the apprentice. And so then, in the Eastern Empire, you've got the emperor and the apprentice. And the system was supposed to work where they would make major joint decisions together, but that they would each rule their part of the empire. And then the emperor would be able to retire peacefully, and the apprentice would take his place. That happened for one turn, and then when Constantine and Maxentius, I'm like, I kept thinking Maximian, I'm like, that's not right. Maxentius, whenever the two of them succeeded and became emperors, that's when the Civil War took place. But the reason why they split the empire into East and West is because there were major cultural differences. The Western was more geared towards Rome as a center, and the Eastern was more geared towards Greek cultural practices in general. So you've got Latin on one side and more Greek-oriented on the other side. And that split followed throughout the history, and in fact we still see it today, throughout the history of Christianity. So Byzantine Catholicism and also Eastern Orthodoxy, still very rooted in what that Eastern Church was doing at the time. And in terms of when stained glass came into use, I would say that that would have been a relatively more modern invention. So within the past 200 to 300 years, we started to see stained glass. In terms and I should pivot away from more painted iconography.
Mm-hmm.
Other questions?
So I noticed that in the Cathedral of Syracuse, they had a crater for, they had a baptistry, right? But instead of having so I've noticed that a lot of early church buildings had separate buildings for baptisms.
Yes.
Did Syracuse ever have a separate baptistry, or was it always just in the font?
It was always just in the font. They never had a separate baptistry. Then even through the Renaissance, that was a common practice to have separate baptistries, and they're often round, so people could gather around the font.
One other example, I know a lot of people here have seen the Altoona Cathedral, which is probably, if there was a spare no expense church in our diocese, that would be it. Can you talk about, when you talked about the styles in Altoona Cathedral?
That's a good one. I'm going to pull it up in my mind's eye. So I think it has a lot of elements that are similar to St. John's.
Yeah, I would have thought the neoclassical.
Yeah, and if you recall, so with St. John's, I put Renaissance-inspired / neoclassical. So let me talk a little bit about neoclassical. Neoclassical is very similar to Renaissance, very similar to ancient Greek and Roman, but the difference is everything's white. So St. John's is a perfect example. All the sculptures are white. In antiquity, and this was because by the time it got to the neoclassical period, and even kind of the Renaissance, the paint had faded. But the reality was everything in the ancient world was painted. All sculptures were painted, all temples were painted. It was a multicolored, technicolor world because they were really ugly colors, very garish. Whites, oranges, yellows, and blues, and red. That was pretty much the palette. So around the neoclassical time, people thought that all sculptures were just white in antiquity, so that's how they created them. So that's how we get that. But that's, I think that the cathedral in Altoona is very similar to St. John's in that respect.
The type, the post-World War II type, what was that called?
Contemporary.
Contemporary. Would Holy Name, considering it has almost no wood, no conventional means, would it be in its whole different category almost, or?
I think that would be, so I'm having a hard time recalling the specifics, so let me crowdsource it. What do you guys think? You're semi-experts now that we've walked through it. No one wants to commit?
Very contemporary.
Very contemporary.
It's very utilitarian in this.
Yeah, that's contemporary.
Yeah.
So think of concrete. I don't know if there's concrete there, but concrete is contemporary. Modern building materials. Lack of ornamentation, abstract stained glass windows, modern building materials, contemporary. Large open spaces for lots of people, contemporary.
Wasn't there, I can't think if it was a Vatican thing or if it was just a bishop thing around here or something, commissioning more modern, plain, functional churches, like just down the road there is Church of the Visitation of the Blessed Virgin Mary. That's one I think of.
Yeah.
Yeah, what was the thing that put that into play around here?
That's a Father Matt question.
Yeah.
Sure. So the way I would see it, absolutely everything Carrie was talking about up to the contemporary period, but within that contemporary period, you have a number of different structures and a number of different styles. One of the big turning points was Vatican II. So with the Second Vatican Council, there was a vision that we had this historic vision, but they wanted a focus on the role of the laity in the church. And that the laity were a part of the church. So they started to try to revive different styles that would communicate that. You now also had modern building materials where you weren't limited in the same way you used to be. So that's where you get in the round churches like St. Andrew's, St. Anthony's Wimber, some of those other rounded designs, where an idea of the people could see the other people and participate. That was one big component of kind of modern architecture. The other one was there was a move away from a lot of iconography and a lot of design, so that the focus was completely on the altar. And some of these were styles that didn't last very long, but when they kind of eliminated everything except the altar, there's a style called brutalist.
Yeah, okay, concrete and glass, that's what you got there.
Yeah, concrete and glass, but it was just this, we want this giant space with this focus on the one thing, so that you had your full attention on that one thing. The other thing I think in church history had a big impact was something happened in the 1930s and 40s that had never happened before in history. Universal literacy. So prior to that, the assumption was people can't read, so they got to look at these windows, they got to look at the glass, they got to look at everything else. And so there was a thought for a period that, well, now that people can read, let's let them focus on the book and the text and the thing going on that they can read, and focus on the subject rather than all this other stuff. Now that has kind of gone away at this point, but that was a period in the church. Does that kind of make sense?
Yep.
And another perfect illustration of how architecture shapes the experience. So focuses your attention on where you should place it. Go ahead.
Do you think a lot of these ancient, historic designs and architecture of churches are becoming sort of like lost skills, where a lot of people wouldn't be able to do them, or they might not be able to be recreated now?
That's a good question. I think that the rebuilding of Notre Dame shows us that there are still, you can find them, or you can learn them. So I don't think that they're as pervasive as they were in the past, but I think that we can come together, relearn those skills, or just apply those trades when necessary. A great question.
Actually, I have two questions, but the first
Go
one
for
is
it.
more or less in regards to Notre Dame. How close were they during the reconstruction to the classical Notre Dame when they reconstructed? It was almost a one-to-one, or were there aspects they didn't remake?
I can tell you after March, I'm going to go see. I haven't seen it since it's been rebuilt. So but my understanding is that they were there were some elements that were changed by necessity, but for the most part, they were as faithful to the original as possible.
Got it. And then the second one is more on mathematics in regards to architecture, proportions and stuff. How often do they follow, for example, the golden rule and proportions when doing the designs?
Okay, so when I mentioned these classical architectural proportions, what I was referring to was the so-called golden rule, which is a architectural formula that was developed by the Greeks. And they followed that with many churches. I don't think Gothic churches follow those proportional rules, and certainly Romanesque did, Renaissance did, and maybe not Baroque. So maybe at least with a couple interruptions up until the Renaissance. Now, Byzantine did not.
Gotcha.
Byzantine was something different. They were focused on different things.
Understood. All right.
So, you mentioned when you were talking about Baroque and Rococo that they had spiral columns. Were those inspired by the so-called Solomonic columns from Old St. Peter's, or is that just a thing that was going on?
It was, so yes and no. So yes, they had that in their visual, that was a visual paradigm, so they had that example. But also spiral columns, there was a Roman Baroque period. So the Romans had this similar period of experimentation where they created imperfect, incomplete fragments, incomplete architectural fragments, spiral columns, and things along those lines. So they had that example as well. So I would say that there's an earlier origination for the spiral columns at St. Peter's, and then for the spiral ones we see in the Baroque. Great questions, guys. Yeah.
With regard to Old St. Peter's, I've often heard that the burial places of the popes had previously been there, and that whenever Old St. Peter's was demolished, all of those tombs were kind of just lost or disregarded, not really preserved. So a lot of those popes are no longer, the bodies are no longer intact.
So I think that we've lost track of some of them, but I know that there was a conscious effort. So the Old St. Peter's was demolished during the Renaissance, and because they needed a bigger worship space, they were doing interesting things architecturally, and it just didn't suit their purposes anymore. So Old St. Peter's was built on top of a cemetery. So underneath it there's a crypt, underneath it there's a cemetery. So I think that some of the burials were transferred underneath, but it is possible that some were lost as well.
Thank you.
I think is it Sacred Heart Cathedral or Basilica Notre Dame in South Bend?
Oh, yeah.
Is it? I'm a fan of the college football team, but I've never been there. Is that supposed to be pretty spot on to the one over in France?
So not being a pretty big fan of the sports team, I'm not sure.
Okay.
I don't know if I've ever seen it, and I can't picture
Okay.
it. But if anyone else wants to take a stab at it, we can crowdsource again.
It could probably be figured out pretty quickly. I'm sure.
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah.
Great question.
Oh, one more.
Sure.
Do you have a favorite out of all the styles you mentioned this evening?
No, I don't. I like them for different reasons and different functions, I guess. I'm boring like that. Okay. Yeah.
In light of that, do you have either a favorite or a most interesting church, either in the Johnstown area or in the broader Western Pennsylvania area?
My own. So there's a church at blanking, help me out, seminary.
Latrobe?
Yes, Latrobe.
St. Vincent's.
St. Vincent's. That's impressive. That's, I think, in this region, and without going to Pittsburgh, I think that's the closest you get to stepping inside of what would feel like one of those European cathedrals.
So, do you think that the ambulatory and Romanesque churches evolved from the annular crypt, like we would see in St. Peter's or in Old Saint Denis?
Yeah, so that's something I toyed with bringing up, the ambulatory. So just so we're all on the same page, there was another early Christian church form that wasn't a basilica, and it was round, and there was typically the altar in the center, but it was based on ancient Roman mausoleums where the tomb was in the center and people could perform rituals on the outside. Early Christian worship, early masses, involved a lot of walking and movement. So the ambulatory, and that would be basically an aisle around the altar, was very important and very, I guess it fit very well with the types of rituals that were taking place. So I think that that is a vestige, like it's connected. That's what it's connected to. That makes sense. Did I finish? Did I answer your question?
Well, the reason I bring it up is because the annular crypt was, I mean, the function of the annular crypt is essentially the same as the ambulatory. And
Right.
if we look at a Pilgrimage Road Romanesque church, it serves the same function. People can go and look at the altar without disrupting the masses that are going on.
Mm-hmm.
So that's why I asked that question. I wanted to
Okay.
get your take on that.
Okay. Yeah, so again, I do think I think it's rooted in that early practice, but over time it essentially served a different function, and that was to allow people to walk around the church, as you mentioned, instead of disturbing the mass. But it has its roots in early worship practices. So it wasn't too far off. Go ahead.
I'll give one for you. All of the kind of basis for stuff, we've talked a lot about the Roman stuff. Do you think the Jewish temple influenced any of those architectures?
None of the early ones. None of the early ones, and especially not the European ones. No. It was strictly Roman. So it was a rejection of, in many cases, of ancient Roman religion and an adoption of things that were secular in Roman society, and also things that were conducive to their Christians' particular worship style, not Jewish.
In terms of the older liturgies in the early periods, I've seen some different modern takes on where the gospel is read physically in the church. I've seen some traditions where the gospel is read in the middle of the nave. I've seen other places, obviously, where it's read from the altar or from the ambo. Do you have any thoughts on that?
I don't, and I'll tell you why. Because my expertise is more on the actual building itself rather than a ton of, so you have some visibility into the practices, but not a ton. So I really can't say. Maybe Father Matt can.
I'm not weighing in on that one.
That's a safe position. Well, I think they're getting the cane out to cool me off. But
Yeah.
safe, so.
Thank you, Carrie.
Thank you.
Very good. You ever thought about going to school to get your doctorate?
Terrible idea.
Thank you. Just a couple announcements. As I mentioned in the invites in the group me, we have some Advent reflections by Bishop Barron. They're by the entrance over there, free of charge, provided for by the group from a grant that we got from the Independent Catholic Foundation. So please grab one of those on your way out. Moving forward, there's still have some flyers left to run towards the end of these. Our next event is going to be on December 12th. That'll be the second Friday of December. We're going to have benediction and board games again after we had some other fun events like our trivia last Friday, which was a lot of fun. We're going to go back to our benediction and board games. We'll do trivia again next year. And then our next Theology on Tap is a week early again next month because of Christmas. But it'll be December 17th here. We're going to have Wally, who is a candidate for the diaconate in our diocese, is going to speak on a church on fire. Food is still available. There's some to-go boxes. And then I'm also going to hand out some surveys to everyone. And I have some pens to go along with that for you guys to fill out. If you could fill those out and either leave them on your table or preferably put them in the free will collection baskets, that would be great. That'll give us some good information moving forward into 2026. And also, if you have any speaker or topic ideas, you can jot it down on there. So thank you guys all for coming. Please remember to take your Advent Gospel Reflection by Bishop Barron. They're only like 2 or 3 pages a day, so it's just a little read over the Gospel. There's a little reflection, and then there's a little area to jot some notes on your response to the reflection. It's a real quick and easy but fruitful prayer every day during Advent. Please take those, and again, definitely please fill out these questionnaires. That'll help give us a good idea of what we have moving forward into 2026. We already have some good speakers that are committed to speaking, such as Father Kenise, who was just assigned to St. John Galbert today, agreed to speak to us probably in January or February. We're going to work on getting him scheduled. And we also have Archbishop William Scarla, who is a Ruthenian Greek Catholic Archbishop from Pittsburgh, is going to speak going into 2026, as well as some other lay people, deacons, religious sisters. So thank you guys all for coming. Get your Advent reflection and fill out that survey. Thank you guys.
And I'll say it, we have had a number of people who have been involved in this, who have been wonderful over the last couple of years, but we also have a couple of people who have aged out, started to move away. So please, next time, bring a friend or six.
Yeah. Understood. And young families, children are also welcome too.
Yes.
So.
See you guys.
I think they're both teachers who were
He'll come to you tonight before you fall asleep. Catherine, you can be here.
I'm not sure the name. I know what you're talking about, but I don't
So,
know.
going well at St. Benedict? Big church. Big church, yeah. Lots of young people. I heard you were playing basketball last week. Yeah, my nephew's in the youth group. They said they were playing basketball. Thank you.
We were always told wherever was used to line the walls, the raised and little boats, and line the base of the fort, where it was holed up there, they used it, and when the flood happened,